Good morning. This morning we find ourselves in our fourth week of Advent. And so for the past 4 weeks, we have been journeying with the prophet Isaiah as we anticipate the advent or the coming of Emmanuel, God with us. This morning, I want us to understand how the prophets are a part of the story of Christmas. But even more so, how they invite us to respond and to continue to prepare our hearts for the coming of the King. Your Christian Old Testament Bible is actually divided into 3 parts. In Hebrew, this is referred to as the Tanakh. The T of the Tanakh actually stands for Torah. Torah serves as the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The N of the Tanakh actually refers to the Hebrew Nevi'im, which represents prophets, where we've been studying the prophets of Isaiah the past 3 and 4 weeks. The K of the Tanakh stands for Ketuvim, which actually in Hebrew means writings. So the Old Testament is comprised of 3 parts. It's comprised of the Torah, it's comprised of prophets, as well as the writings. Now, there are certain characteristics about prophetic literature. When we think of prophets, oftentimes we think that they are prophesying. They are telling the future. But in reality, prophets are more concerned about changing the present more so than they are about predicting the future. You see, one of the reasons that prophets predict the future is because they're wanting people to change today. They're saying, take heart, get ready, repent, change your ways so that this does not happen in the future. So the first thing that we learn is, again, the emphasis that they're more concerned about changing the hearts and minds and spirits of the people of the present than they are in predicting the future. The second thing that we also learn about prophetic literature is that they most always root for the underdog. They serve as a voice to the voiceless, for the widows, for the orphans, for the children, for those that are oppressed, that are downtrodden, that are oftentimes overlooked. They are the ones who speak on behalf of those in need. Now, if you were not poor or downtrodden, or if you were not an individual in society that was overlooked, then prophets can be irritants. Their message is one that you don't want to hear. And so we see consistently in prophetic literature that these prophets are arrested. They're put in jail by those that have power, for they have been speaking out on behalf of others. We also see that their message is similar in nature. For one thing that prophets proclaim is that they clearly denounce idolatry. Consistently, prophets rise up between the time of 800 and 500 BC. It's a tumultuous time in Israel's history. And what we see in the Israelites is that they constantly are turning from God. Even though God has heard the cry of the Israelites, even though He has delivered them out of captivity and slavery in Egypt, even though there's been the parting of the Red Sea, there's been a deliverance into the Promised Land, still, these Israelites choose to put and to worship other gods in the place of the one true God. And so constantly prophets are calling the people back to their one true love, are calling people to return so that again they can know the height and the breadth and the depth of God's amazing grace for them. What we also see is not only is there a call back, turning from the ways of idolatry, but also we see that there is a consistent message of justice. In the Old Testament, the word justice is used over 1,000 times. We hear from prophets like Micah that ask the question, what does the Lord require of you? But to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Isaiah 58, 6 and 7 states it in this way. Is not this the kind of fasting that I have chosen? To loosen the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? For when you see the naked, you are to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. There's a story about a man by the name of Richard Stearns that recounts his journey to becoming the president of World Vision International. If you're not familiar with World Vision International, it's a Christian organization that works with children in third world countries to tackle the issues and sources of human poverty. Those things that actually keep as well as prevent these children from flourishing to all that God perhaps has created them to do. Richard has always been a successful businessman. In fact, he began working in marketing with the Gillette Company. From there, he held various roles at Parker Brothers, which actually culminated with him being hired as president. He became, from them, vice president of Franklin Mint, and then joined Lenox Collections as their CEO. Richard was making a seven-figure income, he was living on a beautiful estate, and he was an evangelical Christian. You see, one day, one of his friends had been praying and actually called him after his time of prayer and said, I just heard that World Vision International has lost their CEO, and I think you may be the next CEO. You see, Richard wasn't looking for a job. He found himself to be quite comfortable. Life was good. His family was thriving. His career